All right, guys, welcome. We're going to discuss Chapter 8, Section 2, and revolutions that disrupted Europe and nationalism. So nationalism, we spoke about briefly here in the United States. Feelings of nationalism we call patriotism. So any of the patriotic stuff of waving flags and pride in our country really is nationalism at other levels. So nationalism, belief that one's greatest loyalty should not be to a king or empire, but to a nation of people who share a common culture and history. Here again in the United States, we simply call that patriotism. But in Europe, nationalism had a profound impact all over and really led people for these revolutions that occurred all through the 1800s. These revolutions were against the monarchies, and the monarchies had nothing to do with nationalism. People who believed in nationalism didn't want to follow a king or queen. They wanted to follow themselves and form their own nation state. So this whole concept of nationalism wasn't really big until after the 1800s, really the beginning of the 1800s with Napoleon. As the middle class became educated, they spread these ideas around, and these feelings of nationalism grew. Now, some of the bonds that create a nation state, here you are, you might want to pause and write these down. These are important: culture, history, language, territory, nationality, and religion. It could be one of these or all of them together, any type of combination. Here in the United States, we have a common culture, common history. We do not have a common religion or even our ethnic nationality down here. I'm really talking about ethnic ancestry. In the United States, we are more of a melting pot. Whereas you get some countries like Germany, especially with the Nazis, they were ethnically German, and that's what bound them together. Now, there are both positive and negative results of nationalism. It's not always a bad thing. People could overcome their differences for a common good. They were overthrowing colonial masters to create their own countries, especially in Latin America, overthrowing the Spanish and the Portuguese as they started to identify with themselves in the rise of the mestizos. The democratic governments really were based on nationalism, and some friendly competition could spur changes, and especially we just witnessed with the Olympics, friendly competition and people getting behind their own countries. Negatively, you could assimilate, which means these smaller cultures within the nation could go away. You could have extreme views such as Nazis and ethnic cleansing, whereas if you're not perceived as part of the nationality, we can kill you, or just flat-out warfare competition between nations. Impact-wise, again, this is just an overview of nationalism at work. In the 30 years, from 50 to 1980, 47 African countries became independent nations. Yugoslavia broke apart along ethnic lines. For Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia broke away. And then Yugoslavia changed its name to Serbia. And we have the modern-day Balkans. In Europe, there are 47 countries using 50 languages. In Latin America, even though people speak Spanish or Portuguese, many native languages are still spoken. Now, to get away from nationalism briefly, we're going to talk about politics. You'll hear this a lot, right versus left. Really gets down to conservatism and liberalism. Conservatism is associated with the right. Liberalism is associated with the left. We're really talking about, especially in Europe in the early 1800s, conservatives were wealthy nobles, property owners who wanted to protect the way things were, keeping monarchs, the kings, queens, and emperors in charge. If you were a liberal, usually you were a middle-class person, a little bit more money. You wanted more power to elected parliaments, and that way you could have a little bit more say in the government. Of course, if you were a radical, you were an extremist. And really, in this context, in the 1800s, the radicals were extreme liberals. Of course, this political cartoon here refers to the GOP, which is a grand old party, or the Republicans versus the Democrats, and the right versus the left. Here in American politics here, literally today, conservatives are Republicans, known as the right wing. Liberals are Democrats, known as the left wing. We have radicals on both sides, believe you me. Really, right wing versus left wing comes down to the actual configuration of how people sit. There's a center aisle, and the Republicans sit over here on the right, and the Democrats sit on the left. So literally right and left wing. If you look at politics in general, We're going to be discussing this quite a bit this year from now on. Right, again, was conservative. Left is progressive or liberal. It's really not just a straight x-axis. There's a vertical axis as well. If you go farther down, this is the more authoritarian or less freedom. Up here is progressive or more freedom. So it's really a big spectrum here. So if you are really liberal and really freedom, you're an anarchist, no government. The complete opposite is incredibly conservative and no freedom. That makes you a fascist. Very liberal with no freedom is a communist. There really isn't anything up here. It doesn't really fit. Most people, if we take political views on people all across the United States, are going to be scattered around here someplace. The more center you are, the more moderate you are. Most teenagers usually are somewhere around here. Not all, but as a general rule, what happens as you get older is you tend to do this. Again, not always, but if you just look at the general rule. Okay, now getting into history here, really going to talk about the Balkans quite a bit. In the next couple chapters, the Balkans are this area right here in southeastern Europe, talking about Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, among others. The Greeks, in this context, these Greeks were the first ones to win their independence from the Ottoman Empire, here the Ottoman Turks. And then from them, after the Greeks, these other areas became up for grabs. And again, we're going to get into a little bit more details about what happened. Now, in the 1830s, the peace from the Congress of Vienna started to break down. People were openly revolting, and in really the spring of 1848, there were revolutions all over Europe, similar to what happened in the Arab world 2 years ago. Most of these revolts were crushed, but the fact that they had them shows people that people were upset with the way things were. Now, in France has had all kinds of problems. Poor France here. After Louis XVIII, we had King Charles X. X stands for 10 here in Roman numerals. He tried to reestablish absolute monarchy. He got ran out of town. Then you had a king named Louis Philippe. That's this guy, Louis Philippe. He was a pretty low-key guy. He didn't dress like a king. He was actually looked down upon by the nobles. But after 18 years, he fell out of favor, and the monarchy was done. We had the Second French Republic set up. The First French Republic was set up by Robespierre in the Revolution. So they set up another one. Immediately started to fall apart. The political groups could not get together. They fell into factions, which are separate groups. They literally had bloody battles in the streets. They called a new constitution in Parliament. They said, we need a new way to run the government. We need a strong president. And in December of 1848, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, his name, just to confuse you, is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected president of France. So that's Napoleon Bonaparte's brother's son, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He became really the president. He has besides from having a really outstanding mustache, he did a lot of good things. But 4 years into his rule as president, he crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III. Emperor Napoleon II was Napoleon Bonaparte's son, although he never actually served as emperor. That's his cousin. That's Napoleon III's cousin, so he called himself Napoleon III. A lot of people welcomed him. He encouraged industrialization. They built a bunch of things for the people, public works projects. Things actually went quite well, but eventually the economy turned, and Napoleon III was driven out of town as well. Now, lastly, just talk about Russia quickly. Last time we spoke about Russia, it was Catherine the Great. Russia, for the middle of the 1800s, was still feudal. It's really like going in a time warp. 50% of the 40 million peasants were serfs, which were essentially slave farmers for the nobles. These nobles had almost limitless power over these poor people. A lot of people in Russia wanted it to end, but how are they going to do that? So what happened is Russia fought a war. They lost this war called the Crimean War, which is the Crimean Peninsula down in the Black Sea. Alexander II became the new Tsar, and he started reforming things. So here's Alexander II. He frees the serfs in a proclamation in 1861. It took place very close to the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln. Now, basically what they said is like, okay, serfs, you're going to be free. We're going to give half of the land owned by the nobles to the serfs. To keep the nobles happy, they pay the nobles for the land. So the government told the serfs, hey, we just bought your freedom. You owe us the money for that. You have 49 years to pay us back. You cannot move from your land until you pay us back. Essentially, it's going to take their entire lifetime. So even though they were legally free, they were debt tied to the land. For his troubles, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and the new Tsar Alexander III came along, stopped the reforms, and really nothing happened in Russia until the Russian Revolution, which wasn't until World War I. There you go. That is a good overview of Chapter 8, Section, I believe, 2.